Okay, thanks very much, Nick. Oh, thank you. Well, this event, which we've held for a number of years now, organised by the Eastern Region comrades, particularly from Stevenage, with a huge amount of hard work, is a very good opportunity for socialists to enjoy themselves and to discuss in a more relaxed setting. And I know we've got bands later tonight. It's the Saturday night of the camp. So I'm under a certain amount of pressure to let you get on to the more relaxed part and not spend too much time on the political discussion. I've also seen the Facebook photographs of those of you who were here last night sitting freezing, and I realise that the temperature is likely to drop. So I'm going to try and speak relatively briefly and not cover every issue in the world. That's clearly impossible. You discussed the Middle East last night, which is a very important part of what's taking place in the world at the moment. But just to make a few points on some of the main themes, but also on how some of those issues affect us and what we're facing in Britain as well. Now, when the economic crisis began, we said that we were entering an era of revolution and counter-revolution. And I think it's clear to everybody, as I will go on to explain, that that has been and is being fully borne out. And there's no end to the economic crisis. The capitalists do not have a way out of the crisis that their system is facing. That doesn't mean that there will be no periods of growth. But if you look, example, at the OECD, who unusually did a long-term survey on the prospects for growth of their system of capitalism, then they estimated that growth rates for the next 45 years will be just 2/3 of the current paltry rate. So that is their estimation of the prospects for capitalism globally. Thankfully, if we get our way, and it shouldn't be the case, we will not have capitalism for another 50 years. But it shows the character of capitalism in the 21st century. That even while we're supposedly back in boom, stagnation is the new normal. If you look at the Eurozone, I don't know how many people saw the Nobel Prize winning economist Joseph Stiglitz, but he was in Germany and he was asked, is Europe facing a lost decade? This was just yesterday. And he was unequivocal in his answer, where he said, do you mean that Europe is the new Japan? Yes. The only way you can describe Europe today is as being in a depression, something that we have explained for a whole period of time. Of course, the difference between Europe today and Japan, when it first went into crisis in the 90s, is that that was in a period of growth for world capitalism overall. Now Europe is in crisis, having been pushed back now, even in formal terms, into recession, at the same time as the world as a whole is stagnating. The US and Britain have finally, the size of their economies, reached pre-crisis levels. But I mean, it's taken a long time for that to take place. And even where that is, we know this, there's no feel-good factor, because the economies may have started to grow in formal terms, but that is not reflected in people's wages, which are continuing to lag behind. It's a joyless recovery. But there's no question, actually, the propaganda of there being a recovery has had an effect on consciousness. And it's not a negative consequence for us. If you look at the success that we've had in the US, the movement around $15 an hour, the victories that have been won on that, a factor in that is undoubtedly the idea that the US economy was growing again. So where's our recovery? We want our share. That, in my view, is also a factor in what is taking place in Britain with the development of public sector strike action in a pre-election period, which we've not seen for some decades, is a feeling amongst workers. You're telling us we've got endless austerity, and at the same time you're telling us that the economic crisis is meant to be over. Well, if it's over, then we want our share. By the way, if you look at the events taking place in the US with the tragic shooting of the young black man in Ferguson, the question of the state brutality in the US is clear, But another big factor is the economic situation there as well, with the movements that are taking place against police repression is also related to the fact that the black working class are overwhelmingly part of the poorest section of the working class in the US and are angry about state repression, but also about their living conditions. I don't have time to go into this, but the average household income in the area of Ferguson where he was killed is $14,000 a year for a household in the richest country of the planet. I mean, it's an incredible level of poverty that that section of the working class in the US are facing. The capitalists themselves have no faith in their own system or in a recovery. That's reflected in the fact that at best they have stagnating investment and the continued accumulation of enormous piles of cash, which they cannot see the point of investing in industry because they do not think they will make a profit from it. And that's while in Britain interest levels are at the lowest level for 300 years, and yet still they would rather sit on their money than invest it as a result of the crisis in their system. There's a certain division developing, or beginning to develop, amongst the capitalists on that. People will have seen the Bank of England Monetary Policy Committee for the first time had a split vote on whether they needed to start to raise interest rates. At this stage, they decided not to do that, and I don't think they will this side of a general election. But the fact is, if they do at a certain stage raise interest rates, which they'll be forced to at some point, then that raises the prospect of the bursting of the rebuilding of the financial bubbles that are fueling the British economy. And there's the prospect here, if Labour managed to win the general election, and you then have not only them continuing with austerity, and let's remember at the Policy Forum, which by the way had about 45 trade union representatives at it, and 14 people voted against continuing with Tory spending plans under a Labour government, which says something about the role that the trade union leaders played at that forum. But you have the prospect of them continuing with austerity, a Labour government, but also having a new bursting of the financial bubbles under a new minority Labour government or Labour government. Imagine, I mean, the flack they've taken for being held responsible for the start of the first economic crisis, how they would then be held responsible for a new, and this would be bubbles bursting on the background of a much worse general economic situation. To say that Labour could be as unpopular as Hollande in France could be a real underestimation. You could not rule out the shattering of the Labour Party like PASOK in Greece. Such would be their unpopularity in that situation. But even before a new stage of crisis, then, as I said, what we face is stagnation. Globally, 25% of the world population are unemployed or underemployed. We're seeing everywhere the growth of the precariat. The world's working class, if you like, is being pushed down. So countries like Britain are developing characteristics of southern Europe, of the poorest countries of Europe. If you look at the recovery in jobs in Britain, then 2/5 of all new jobs since 2010 have been self-employed. That is not entrepreneurs who are going to be the next Microsoft or Starbucks or whatever. That is people working in reality on 0-hour contracts with no rights, doing it because there's nothing else they can get for a few hours a week and being formally self-employed. And the capitalists wonder why wages aren't going up when that is the character of the jobs that have been created. It's the growth in reality of a black market and informal sector in Britain, which has not existed on that scale in the past, but would have been a characteristic of the countries of southern Europe. Meanwhile, for southern Europe, the conditions become more like the neo-colonial world. And of course, the neo-colonial world faces a nightmare. And I don't have time to deal with the question of immigration, but this issue over the last summer of people trying desperately to get from Africa across to Europe, I mean, it proves what we've said, that there are no barriers you can build that are high enough that will prevent people trying to find a way to make a decent living. And if you close every land barrier, if you put up massive barbed wire fences and you shoot at people if they try to cross, and that's what they've done, then people will risk their lives in leaky boats trying to get across the Mediterranean. But that's the reality increasingly in many countries of Africa. So we have, you know, this is growth. This is meant to be the economy getting a little bit better on a global scale. Obviously, the current turmoil for world capitalism comes really from the after effects of the crisis that began in 2007. But having said that, we're not suggesting that every country is affected equally and at the same time. What we're seeing now actually is parts of the world that appeared to have escaped the crisis in 2007 are now being affected. So even Australia had a 23-year boom. The boom carried on. It looked like they were immune from what was taking place in the rest of the world, but Australia is now facing recession. The reason is simple. It's China. Because Australia's economy has been increasingly reliant on selling raw materials to China, and as China goes into crisis, then that is affecting the few booming parts of the world. It's also had a dramatic effect in Brazil. The big movements that we've seen in Brazil, it's not a coincidence. Their rate of growth has gone from 7.5% a year in 2010 to 1% today as a result of a slowing economy in Brazil, in China. And actually, in a sense, the Americas, North and South, are at the fore of class struggle at this point in time. Europe was, but has dipped back a bit. But at the moment, it's more what's taking place in the Americas. And it's interesting what's happening in Argentina. There's been very little on it actually covered in the British press. But what you've had, the default that has taken place on the debt in Argentina is as a result of a few holdouts, vultures in reality, gamblers on the world stock markets who have tried to take Argentina to the cleaners. It was described by one Trotskyist, actually, economist in The Guardian a couple of days ago, where he said they knew what they were doing when they bought those bonds for pennies on the dollar, hoping to score big on a struggling country. They're like gamblers who try to sue the casino when they put a little bit of money on black and it comes up red. And these few bondholders have been chasing the Argentinian government through the courts ever since the crisis that took place there at the turn of the century. And that has now resulted in the default that has taken place in Argentina. But actually, it's not just about those few bondholders. It's also about capitalism as a whole, wanting to say to workers worldwide, don't you dare default on your debt. We will not let you get away with it. You will be punished. And that's why they've chased the Argentinian government over this long period of time. We stand clearly for the repudiation, the cancellation of the debt. They should just say, no, we're not going to pay a penny. But we don't leave it there. We link it to the nationalisation of the banks, a state monopoly of foreign trade, to a socialist programme, and the idea of spreading that socialist programme internationally. But when the crisis first hit in 2001 in Argentina, and this is interesting for our future in Europe, they overthrew 5 governments in a month. It was incredible. Governments just kept falling in the face of these mass movements by the Argentinian working class. But there was no mass political expression of that. In fact, there was an anti-party mood, a feeling, a plague on all your houses, you're all the scum of the earth, we want nothing to do with any of you. Last year, before the latest developments, Trotskyist forces got 1 million votes in Argentina, and it's clear that people are now seeing the need to vote left, to vote for socialist ideas as a result of their experience. That you can say they're all the same, but if you don't build a replacement, you just end up with another lot of people who are not going to carry out the interests of the working class. And that is something we should be aware of for the future in Europe, but also now, in the wake of the latest developments in Argentina, there is likely to be a new wave of struggle out of which there will be further opportunities for socialist and Trotskyist forces. Just one other point I want to make on the economy before I move off it, which I think is an important underlying factor which we have to draw out, is the role of new technology, and that's the role of new technology in a socialist society. Labour-saving technology has the potential to liberate humanity. It has the potential to allow us to have a 25-hour working week and to have leisure time to spend discussing and going to camps and doing whatever we want to do. But of course, under capitalism, it's a cause of crisis. And increasingly, what we see in Britain, young people go and learn all kinds of skills and then they end up working in Costa because there are no skilled jobs available for them. Now that's affected the working class over a long period of time, but actually it's also beginning to affect big sections of the middle class, where middle class jobs like architecture and people who do, not economists, that's not what I mean, accountants, that's what I'm trying to think of. Many of those jobs are now automated in a way that they wouldn't have been in the past. So there's a few at the top who do well, but the majority are being pushed down. And that has big political consequences. There was a very interesting article by the managing editor of The Economist about Britain, and he makes some quite telling points on the political consequences of that process, where he says the consequences of the growth of inequality and how the middle class is being torn asunder, with many middle class jobs being automated, and a result, the majority of submerging professionals are being pushed down into the ranks of the working class. And the political conclusions he draws from that is Tony Blair liked to think he was reinventing the Labour Party for a moderate and middle class future. In fact, he was retrofitting it for a world about to disappear. The crisis of the middle class will create increasingly volatile politics. Minority parties such as UKIP may make dramatic gains, but even if they fail, because the Westminster mould is hard to break, disruption is coming. Protest groups will become more combustible as old certainties are removed. Even established parties will flirt with more radical ideas. Withdrawal from the European Union on the right and the nationalisation of industry on the left as they compete to harness popular anger. That is not from a socialist, but that is a very good description of the political processes that are starting to take place in Britain and in other countries. And by the way, if you look at the figures for Britain, if you look at middle class professions, their wages in real terms have gone down now over several decades, apart from doctors and people who work in the financial sector. Everybody else, every other section, have had their wages put down. And it's against that background that the capitalists are so terrified of any movement which draws attention to the inequality that exists in society. I mean, Piketty, this French economist, when he first wrote, we thought, well, we're going to have to just write stuff criticising, because what he says is so moderate. I mean, he was interviewed on Newsnight and he was asked his position about whether he wanted to get rid of inequality, and he said, look, in his trendy French accent, the bottom 50% own 3% of the wealth. I do not agree with that, but maybe 5 or 8% would be okay. I mean, this is not a radical economist. But he's been attacked viciously by the Financial Times and other, trying to discredit his figures. And so we've actually had to kind of stick up for him a bit at the same time as criticising his very moderate conclusions. But it reflects what they fear about the mood that is growing in society below. The same thing actually is true about Miliband. I mean, you think, why are you going on about Red Ed? Have you ever seen someone safer for capitalism than Ed Miliband as the leader of the Labour Party? But they're not frightened of the leadership of the Labour Party. They're frightened of the appetite that anybody could awaken. That by raising the idea that maybe your gas bill shouldn't go up, it will increase popularity for the idea of nationalising the gas and other power companies. In other words, they're frightened of the appetite that will be created. But actually, as we understand, that appetite will grow regardless of who wins the general election. The US is a bit of an indication of our future. 90,000 people, more than 90,000 people, voting for our candidate standing on a clear socialist programme, particularly young people, being attracted to socialist ideas. There are some things that are simpler in the US. Actually, the fact that you've not had a Labour Party that is wrongly associated with socialism gives them a clearer path than we've got in Britain. But nonetheless, that radicalisation fundamentally comes from the experience of capitalism that led to the Occupy movement and is now leading to growing numbers drawing socialist conclusions. And that is what the future holds in Britain as well, regardless of who wins the general election. And I've commented a little bit on this already, but the public sector strike action that is taking place is, in our view, very significant, because actually we've been through 2 years of a lull. We've described the situation across Europe as mild reaction, and that's been true in Britain as well. Because of the betrayal of the pension struggles, there's then been a relatively low level of strike action at the same time as people have suffered terrible austerity. And in that situation, inevitably, then the capitalist propaganda that it's scroungers or migrant workers or asylum seekers that are blamed for the crisis, that has got an echo from sections of the working class. Now, to some extent, we're still in that period, but the fact that there is now a new upsurge in industrial struggle in the run-up to a general election is very significant. After all, look at the unions that are coming out in October. The big unions, I mean, I know the PCS are out and would always be out, but the big unions coming out are affiliated to the Labour Party. In the past, they would have said, you don't need to go out and strike because a Labour government will solve all your problems. They just can't say that. So even Prentice has to say about how this strike action is designed to put pressure on Labour to actually put forward some positive policies and so on. And that gives an indication of what is coming down the road beyond the general election. This is, and it will be in Britain as well, an era of revolution and counter-revolution. Of course, it is posed more starkly in some other countries than is the case in Britain at the moment. I mean, I've talked about the difficulties, the lull that we've had in the last 2 years in Britain, but that is nothing compared with what the comrades in Greece have faced, because they've had the working class fight heroically. We all know this. More than 30 general strikes taking place, fighting desperately to defend their living conditions. But the absence of any serious mass socialist alternative means that those workers have been defeated at this stage and have suffered a catastrophic fall in living standards. And inevitably, there is a mood in Greece at the moment of despair amongst big sections of the working class because of the reality that they face. But even there, that's temporary. It will change again. The working class have also drawn lessons as a result of the battering they've had, and they have had a battering in the last few years, which they will then use in a new phase of the struggle. And in Greece, for example, you see the election of a Syriza government. The leadership of Syriza have moved to the right at a rate of knots, desperate to prove to Greek and global capitalism that they're respectable and safe and sensible and so on. But despite that, a Syriza government wins the election, workers will think, our government's in power now, and we're going to make sure it acts in our interests. And the comrades in Greece have raised that in that situation, mass occupations of the factories and other workplaces, which have already taken place on a smaller scale, are likely to be posed in Greece. But nonetheless, obviously, in the period they've just been through, it is a difficult situation. We're not naive. We don't say that there's an economic crisis, struggle goes up, and everything is on an upward curve. Clearly, that isn't the case. The working class faced this economic crisis extremely unprepared in terms of its political consciousness and its organisations, and inevitably will suffer defeats as a result of that. And it is a process of both revolution and counter-revolution. And of course, that means, even within Europe, in the worst situations, the question of war being posed. The events in the Ukraine are war coming to Europe. They're a factor, not the only factor, in the growing economic crisis again in the Eurozone at this point in time. But also the Middle East, which I won't spend time on. I know that was discussed last night, but the horrific situation that the working class faces there, after a revolutionary upsurge, now facing counter-revolution in every sense. That doesn't mean that's permanent, or that the revolutionary process is finished. You will see there as well a new upsurge of the struggle at a certain point in time. But of course, at the moment, as we predicted in Iraq, we always said imperialism overthrows Saddam, it will result in the development of 3 Saddams and a breakup of Iraq with different dictatorial warlords, and that is what's developing or developed in Iraq at this point in time. Now, just before, how long have I spoken for? Okay, so I'll be slightly over half an hour, but not too much. I don't want to spend longer on Iraq because I know that you discussed it last night, but I would just make 1 or 2 general points on how we tackle these issues. And I would recommend that comrades who haven't, you read the article by Peter Taff in the upcoming issue of Socialism Today on the national question and how we approach it, because this is going to come up in more and more countries. And he deals with Israel-Palestine, but he also deals with the question of the Ukraine. It's very complicated, but it's also very simple. We start from a class point of view. And frankly, when you look at the Ukraine and many of the other trouble spots around the world, most forces on the left completely fail to do that. So, you know, we're talking about defending national rights, the right of people to self-determination, their national and democratic aspirations. Actually, they're not socialist demands, they're bourgeois democratic demands. But we understand that the capitalists are incapable of meeting those demands on all sides. And whether it's Putin or whether it's the West, when they talk about meeting different national demands, it's purely cynical by them. All they're interested is in furthering their own economic and strategic interests. Most of the left fall into the trap of understanding that about one side and therefore supporting the other one. And they seem incapable of overcoming that. Peter talks about an anonymous individual. Actually, he's referring to Alan Woods, and I think Becky was in the meeting, so she could perhaps comment on this. But, you know, Alan Woods, someone who in the past would have had a better position than this, actually argued in the solidarity with the anti-fascist resistance in the Ukraine founding meeting that it's not his business to criticise the Russian oligarchy, but if it was, he wouldn't criticise them for intervening too much, but for not intervening at all. Incredibly, he also said that the national question is not an issue in the Ukraine, which is just flabbergasting to say that. And that when you have US imperialism, NATO, Angela Merkel, the condemned government and the Ukrainian fascists on one side, I know which side I'm on. Well, we don't. We're on the side of the working class. The enemy of our enemy is not our friend. When that means you're supporting Putin and the oligarchs, or if it means backing Western imperialism either. We steadfastly uphold the legitimate national aspirations of the peoples of the Ukraine, the Crimea and so on, and we stand for workers' unity and support socialist and workers' forces, even when they're weak in a concrete situation, as the only way forward. Now, of course, that doesn't mean supporting the right of self-determination doesn't always mean supporting separation. You have to look at a situation concretely. But our bottom line is that we do not support the forcible retention of any group or nationality within a state that they consider an oppressor. That's what Lenin and Trotsky were talking about when they developed the right of a nation to self-determination and linked it to the Russian Revolution. And that means, for example, if you look at Crimea, all kinds of questions have been raised about the referendum that took place in the Crimea, and probably a lot of them are true. You know, we're not saying it was a model referendum that took place, and our answer would be to call for a revolutionary constituent assembly, a parliament, to settle the question. But at the same time, it is pretty clear that a majority of the population in Crimea supported a return to Russia. And if that's their view, then we support that, while at the same time steadfastly standing for the rights of the minorities, the Tatars and others within the Crimea. And that approach allows us to deal with even very complicated situations. And as Peter raises in that article, the Ukraine can get more complicated yet, even than it is at the moment. That you could envisage, for example, Donetsk or other cities in eastern Ukraine saying that they want independence from Russia and from the government in Kiev. and having, if you like, the right of self-determination of a state that is a city-state, that is just one city in that situation. But if that was the wish of the majority, you would support that while at the same time linking it to the question of a socialist confederation of the region. Now, we are going to have to deal with these kinds of issues more and more, moving on from the question of the Ukraine. It's not a coincidence, all these wars and conflicts breaking out. Of course, it's a reflection of the economic crisis, but it's also of a growing crisis in world relations, that the imperialist powers are incapable of controlling world events. US imperialism is still the most dominant power on the planet, but it's a declining power, and it no longer has the dominance that it had previously. Increasingly, other forces it comes into conflict with, and it doesn't rule the roost. So, you know, in the question of the Ukraine, it's Putin, Russia's near abroad, but the US and Western European capitalism are not able to just simply decide what takes place. And then they also have the real problem of the political limits of their ability to intervene militarily because of the mood at home. And that's the case in the US, and it's also the case in Britain. If you look at how Miliband ended up scuppering, Britain backing an attack on Syria on Assad, and of course now they're saying, oh, we might have to back Assad a bit because of what's, of what's taking place with ISIS, which says it all. But anyway, if you look at how Miliband ended up not stopping that taking place, it wasn't Miliband's intention. He didn't set out to do that. He wasn't actually opposed to intervention, but he was pushed by the mood of the population, as reflected actually through his own MPs who were saying, we just can't, it's too unpopular, we can't do this, because of after 2003, the profound feeling, we do not want to go and intervene, it's not going to work, it's not going to make things better, troops are going to be killed, and so on. Now they are trying to change that. All the current propaganda, and it's having a certain effect, but there's big limits to how far that effect goes. Particularly when there's no clear way forward. It's obvious to any fool that nothing they can do is going to make the situation better in Iraq. So they are pumping up the propaganda to try and get support at some future stage for being able to intervene. But at this point in time, they're not able to do it, certainly with open troops troops on the ground. The limit is this feeling of an anti-war and an anti-intervention mood, which exists throughout the working class and big sections of the middle class, but of course is sharpest amongst ethnic minorities in Britain. And I will just make a comment or two on this, because Wazi's resignation was completely cynical on her part, but nonetheless reflected a real problem for the Tory party in particular, who are seen by ethnic minorities in Britain overwhelmingly as the racist, nasty, imperialist party. Labour are seen a bit differently. But Labour, with its history of Blair and Iraq, would also be in a very difficult situation when it came to mobilising support for foreign interventions. And it's a problem for the capitalist class that there's a big section of the population who are alienated from this government, actually to a large degree alienated from all of the politicians, and that's true of big sections of society as a whole, but it's probably sharpest amongst people from an ethnic minority background. And there's also a problem for the capitalists that they're terrified of the idea of the growth of terrorism in Britain, the idea of fighters coming back from Syria and then starting to let off bombs in Britain. And it's a real problem for them. And it's understood by big sections of the population. A big reason that people don't support foreign interventions is the idea, you said it'd make the world safer and then we got 7/7. It don't make the world safer, it makes it more dangerous for us here in Britain. But they've got no solution. You can see the argument taking place now. It's not just within the Tory party, it's within different wings of the capitalist class, because the propaganda about, well, we've got to drain the swamp, you know, Gove's position, we should arrest everybody for thinking Islamist thoughts and so on. Well, the more intelligent ones realise that will only foster growth in opposition to them, but they don't have another alternative either, and they're fumbling around to look for a solution. Of course, we understand that while they are right to be worried about that, the vast majority of the Muslim population in Britain are completely opposed to ISIS, opposed to terrorism. They're angry with this government, but they don't see terrorism as in any way a way forward. On the contrary, they understand it would lead to an increase in racism and Islamophobia. And the main thing we have to emphasise is what the capitalists need to be worried about above all is that we're at the start of a new phase of the class struggle in Britain. And I just want to make a few more points on prospects beyond the election before I finish. I'll be interested in comrades' views, but in the EC's view, we can't say with certainty who is going to win the general election. I know it's not very far away, but politics is so volatile, all of the parties are so unpopular, that it really is hard to work out. Now, having said that, the electoral arithmetic actually favours Labour, and Labour ought to be able to at least be the biggest party, even if they're not capable of forming a majority government. And probably hatred of the Tories will result in that happening, but it's not guaranteed. Miliband is capable of throwing this election away with his complete inability to put forward policies that get a popular chord because he's so terrified of saying anything that will annoy the capitalist class. Now, if that happens, if Labour can't even win this election, then the "what is the point of Labour" cry is going to become deafening. You know, Len McCluskey, the leader of Unite, has raised, well, if Labour lose the election, then we've got to have a new party. He was forced then under pressure from his members to say, and actually maybe we need one even if they win the general election. It's not a question of his intentions, but it's a question of what that reflects about the mood of members of Unite and how that would grow beyond the election. But also this Tory government has been very lucky. They have managed to carry through huge austerity, mainly as a result of the betrayal of the trade union leaders, but they're not going to get away with it if they manage to form another Tory-led government. In 2010, there was a section of the middle class, and even of the working class, who believed the guff about caring conservatism. The Tories had changed. Cameron wasn't like Thatcher, he was a lovely man. Nobody believes that anymore after the experience of the last 5 years. In fact, more than ever, the Tory party cannot reach significant sections of the population. That includes the majority, as I said, who come from ethnic minority backgrounds, but it also includes the North, pretty much completely. You know, Liverpool, Manchester, they don't have Tory councillors, they don't exist. Look at what's taking place in Scotland. If there is a vote for independence, that will be a huge blow to the prestige of British capitalism, but also to the Tory party for allowing that to happen. But even if, as is most likely, the referendum is lost, perhaps narrowly, the fact is an enormous factor, the biggest factor, in why Scottish workers are voting for independence is hatred of the Tory party and what they've carried out and the fact they don't want anything to do with them anymore. So the Tories are a very weak force, and a new Tory government would undoubtedly face big social explosions. The divisions in the Tories would also come to the fore. They've got away with Europe by saying we'll have a referendum in 2017, but if they're then in power in 2017, they've got problems, because Cameron will probably be forced to argue to stay in, because that is the position of the majority of the capitalist class in Britain. But that's not the position of most of his party, and there will be divisions. And let's remember, one thing you can say is a Tory majority government is not a likely prospect. So they will be in coalition perhaps with the Liberals again, or ruling as a minority government, maybe even having to lean on UKIP MPs as well as on Liberal Democrat MPs. So it will be an extremely unstable situation for them. If Labour wins, and that is, in our view, I suppose at the moment looks a bit more likely, she says very conditionally indeed, then their problems as well are just beginning. There is not going to be a honeymoon in the old sense of the word. There are not big hopes that Labour is going to make people's lives better. Now that doesn't mean if Labour manage to win, there won't be some hopes. Let's give them a little bit of a chance. But much more than in the past, there are big sections of the working class who already think they're all the same. I mean, that's why they might not win the election. It's a very interesting poll just before the May elections, which asked about Labour's policy pronouncements, the ones that seem good. rent controls, price freeze for energy bills and so on. And in fact, when you look at them, there's not much substance. But the thing is, people understand that because they were all popular. All of them made people more likely to vote Labour. But in the same poll, people were asked, do you believe that Labour will do them? And they said no. And that's the problem, isn't it? For Labour, but it also means that a Labour government carrying out vicious austerity is going to very quickly face opposition. And that is indicated by the strike action that is taking place even in the run-up to a general election. The idea of a 24-hour general strike, we're still raising it. But actually in most workers' minds, while they support the coordinated strike action, a 24-hour general strike is not posed concretely before the general election. But after the general election, when they have another government carrying out the same policies, that is going to be posed centre stage again, as is the question of a new party. And I suppose my final point would be, is we are in a very volatile world, and that does make working out perspectives difficult. But what we can definitely say in Britain is, having been through a bit of a lull in the last 2 years, workers' struggle is now beginning to grow again. And under the next government of whatever stripe, we will have opportunities to build support for socialist and Marxist ideas on a much bigger scale than we've had up to now, and can really begin to make the breakthroughs we need to go to 3,000 members, to 5,000 members and beyond. So I'll leave it there.